Run a modern instrument over the soil of a low green hill in Shaanxi in central China, and the reading spikes. Mercury. Not a trace of it. Far above the natural background, more than the ground of an ordinary plain should ever hold. A heavy, silver, poisonous metal, seeping up out of something buried underneath. From the outside, the hill is nothing. Grass, a few trees, the worn-down shape of a flattened pyramid, softened by 2,000 years of rain. The kind of hill most people drive past without a second look. A mile to the east of this hill stand the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-size clay soldiers drawn up in ranks in the earth. It is one of the most visited ancient sites in China and one of the most photographed discoveries on the planet. And the soldiers are not facing the hill. They stand with their backs to it, looking out across the plain, away from the mound, as though the mound behind them were the thing they had been set there to guard. Under that hill is a man. He called himself the first emperor of China. He conquered everything he could reach, and then he spent the rest of his life and the wealth of an entire empire trying not to die. He is still down there, in a sealed chamber no one has opened in 22 centuries, in ground still laced with mercury, the same metal he swallowed to live forever. And the poison leaves a simple question in the soil. What was a man who had beaten every enemy in the world so afraid of that he flooded his own grave to keep it out? 22 centuries before any instrument read that soil, he was a boy of 13. His name was Yangzheng, and in the year 246 before Christ, he became king of Qin, the hardest and most disciplined of the states then carving up the land that would one day be called China. He was a child. Around him, the men who really ran the kingdom went about the business of the state. And one of the things they had already set in motion in the first year of a 13-year-old's reign was the digging of his tomb. This was not unusual on its own. A king's grave was a lifetime's work, and you began it early. What was unusual was the child, because this boy would grow into perhaps the most relentless human being of the ancient world, and the grave they broke ground on that year would grow along with him, season after season, until it had swallowed a mountainside and the labor of a generation. First, though, he had a world to take. When Yangzheng came to the throne, 7 great kingdoms were left, the survivors of centuries of fighting so constant that the whole era has its own name in Chinese history: the Warring States. 7 kingdoms, and then, one by one, 6. Han fell first, then Zhao, then Wei, then the vast southern kingdom of Chu, then Yan, whose prince, in desperation, had sent an assassin to kill him, and failed. And last, in the year 221, Qi, which gave up almost without a fight. In 9 years, he had taken them all. There was no rival king left anywhere. For the first time in history, the whole of the Chinese world answered to a single man. He was 38 years old, and he had run out of enemies. A man who has conquered the whole world has to decide what to call himself. The old word, king, was not enough. There were 100 fallen kings behind him now, and he had beaten every one. So Yingzheng reached back into legend, to the sage rulers that Chinese tradition remembered as the sovereigns and the emperors, and he took a piece from each and fused them into a title no one had ever worn: Huang Di. We translate it as emperor. He was the first emperor, and he meant the line to run on forever after him. His heir would be the second emperor, and the next the third, he declared, and so on down the years for 10,000 generations. Then he set about making the conquest permanent. The weapons of the beaten kingdoms were gathered up and melted down, and the bronze was recast into 12 giant statues that stood in his capital, so that no one could ever take up those arms against him again. And then he did something rarer than any conquest. He standardized a subcontinent. The many rival scripts of the old kingdoms became one script. The many coinages became one coin, round, with a square hole punched through the middle, a shape that would outlast his dynasty by 2,000 years. He fixed the weights, the measures, even the width of a cart's axle, so that every wheel on every road across his empire ran in the same set of ruts. It is hard to hold the size of that in your head. This is one man reaching down into the daily life of millions of people he would never meet, and setting the distance between the wheels of their carts. What kind of man does that? We have one description of him, written by someone who stood close. A strategist in his own service named Wei Liu left an assessment of the young king, and it is not a warm one. He wrote that this was a man of very little mercy, with the heart of a wolf. That in difficulty he would make himself humble and gracious toward the men he needed, and that once he had taken from you what he wanted, he would think nothing of destroying you. Having written that, Wei Liu is said to have tried to slip out of his service and disappear. By the year 221, he had everything his world could offer. He held more power than anyone in that part of the earth had ever held. Men had tried to kill him. The most famous of them, an assassin sent by the doomed kingdom of Yan, had gotten close enough to lunge at him across the throne room with a poisoned dagger, and had still failed. The king twisted away, drew his own long sword, and struck the attacker down. Steel could not reach him. Armies could not stand in front of him. He had beaten every kingdom and remade the world in his own image, down to the ruts in the road, and defeated every enemy that could be defeated. There was exactly one left. The enemy was death. And the first emperor went to war against it in exactly the way he had gone to war against the kingdoms, totally and without limit. Word reached him of islands far out in the eastern sea, past the horizon, where beings lived who never died, and where a drug grew that could make a man immortal. Around the year 219, he found someone willing to go and fetch it, an alchemist, a seeker of hidden arts named Shaqiu. The emperor gave him ships and a company of young men and women to go with him, hundreds of them, some accounts say as many as several thousand. And Shaqiu sailed east, out past the edge of the known world, to bring back the cure for death. He never came back. Somewhere over that horizon, the whole expedition simply drops out of the record, and whatever became of them, no elixir was ever carried back to the shore. And this was not one desperate gamble, it was a policy pursued for years. The emperor sent expeditions out along his eastern coast, paid for fleets, and kept whole schools of alchemists at his court, every one of them charged with a single task: to find the drug that would stop him from dying. The most powerful state on earth had bent a real share of its enormous wealth toward one purpose: a refusal by a single human being to accept the one thing every human being before him had accepted. He did not take the failure well. The men who had promised him immortality and not delivered it, the alchemists and diviners of his court, began to fear for their lives, and two of them, having criticized him behind his back, fled. In his anger, he ordered a purge of the scholars and occultists who had cheated him. He had already, on his chancellor's advice, ordered most private books in the empire burned. Now he turned on the men who dealt in promises he had bought and never received. This episode is often retold as the massacre of hundreds of Confucian philosophers buried alive. The better reading of the evidence is narrower and stranger. These were mostly the failed sellers of immortality, the men of his own obsession punished for not curing him. And the obsession was closing in on him. He stopped calling himself emperor in private and took up another word: Genren, the true man, the perfected being of legend who walked through fire and water and did not age. He had covered walkways and screened walls built between his palaces so that he could move from one to another unseen, because he had been told that if no spirit and no person could ever find him, then death itself might lose his trail. The most visible man in the world was trying to vanish. And he was taking medicine. His physicians and alchemists prepared for him pills and tonics they called the elixir of life, compounded from cinnabar and other minerals. Cinnabar is a beautiful thing, a deep vermilion red stone prized for its color for thousands of years. It is also mercury ore. The red crystal is mercury and sulfur locked together, and the elixirs built on it carried mercury into the body of the man who swallowed them. The physicians of the age believed that this shimmering, living metal, the one metal that flows like water and will not hold still, must hold the secret of a life that would also not hold still, that would not end. So the first emperor drank it. Day after day, to make himself deathless, he swallowed a mercury-based cure. He drank it to live forever. The cure was mercury. Move forward now, past his death, past the fall of his dynasty, past the rise and collapse of 100 dynasties after it, all the way to a spring morning in 1974. There is a drought in Shanxi. A group of farmers from a village near that same low hill are digging a well, hoping to reach water in the dry red earth about a mile east of the mound. Several feet down, their spades stop hitting soil and start striking fired clay. They pull up broken pieces of it, and then one of them, a man named Yang Jifa, lifts out of the ground a life-size human head. Then clay arms, a clay torso, bronze arrowheads, and the triggers of bronze crossbows scattered in the dirt around them. The villagers were unnerved. Some of them feared they had broken into the ground of a pottery god and dug up a bad omen. What they had actually done was punch a narrow well shaft straight down through the roof of the buried army of the first emperor, which had been standing in its ranks in the dark, a few feet beneath fields those farmers had worked their whole lives for more than 2,000 years. And almost everyone gets this wrong. When people say the farmers found the emperor's tomb, they are mistaken. The well did not strike the tomb. What it struck, a mile out from the grave mound, was not the tomb at all. It was the fence. The soldiers are the outermost edge of the thing. The tomb, the real grave of the real man, is that hill a mile to the west, the one the instrument reads as poisoned. The army stands between the outside world and the mound, and it stands facing away from the grave, out toward the east, the direction the emperor's old enemies had once come from. The soldiers hold a line. They were never set there to be looked at. And there is a hard logic to which way they look. In life, nearly every threat to the man on that throne had come out of the east, from the 6 kingdoms he had spent 9 years crushing. So in death, he set 8,000 soldiers to watch that same horizon and to keep watching it, in case the beaten east should ever rise again. He would not trust the peace, even from inside his own grave. And there are a great many of them. The largest of the 3 pits alone is about the size of 2 football fields laid end to end, and it holds something like 6,000 figures, of which only a fraction have been raised out of the ground. The best estimate for the whole force, most of it still buried, runs upward of 8,000 men. Infantry, archers, cavalry, officers, horses. More than 100 wooden chariots, long since rotted down to their bronze fittings. An entire army at full size in fired clay. They are famous for their faces because every face is different, and you will often hear that each one is the portrait of a particular soldier who really lived. That is not what the evidence shows. The figures were made the way the empire made everything, by system. The bodies were assembled from standardized parts. The faces were pressed from a small set of basic molds, perhaps 8 to 10 of them, and then, while the clay was still soft, finished by hand. A nose reworked here, the set of a mouth changed there, ears and hair and expression added one at a time. The individuality is real, but it is the individuality of a workshop, not a roll call of the dead. Which is, if anything, stranger. A bureaucracy of clay, mass-producing uniqueness on a line, centuries before anyone else built one. An army this size is a serious thing to bury. It cost a fortune, and it took years. And it is only the wall. So the real question is what the wall was built to keep safe. What is behind the guard? Behind the guard is where the whole story turns, and it is the part the crowds mostly never see. Because the soldiers were only the beginning. The first emperor did not stop at an army. He buried a government and a court and a city, and he meant every part of it to keep running. He had spent his life ruling. Ruling was the thing he was, the only thing, and he did not intend to stop merely because he had died. The tomb was not a monument to be visited and admired. It was a place he meant to keep working. A whole functioning state, rebuilt underground, so that the business of empire could carry on around him in the dark. There is an old Chinese principle for how you treat the honored dead. You serve them as though they were still living. He took it further than anyone before or since. He asked himself, in effect, what a working empire needs, and then he buried one of each. An empire needs an army. He had buried an army. But an emperor at court is not only guarded, he is entertained. So closer to the mound, in the late 1990s, archaeologists opened another pit, and it held no warriors at all. It held acrobats. Strong men and entertainers, bare-chested, heavy through the belly, caught mid-motion with their arms lifted. And among them a massive bronze cauldron weighing more than 200 kilograms, the kind of weight a court strongman might have hoisted to amuse the hall. He had buried the palace entertainment. But an empire is not really run by soldiers or by acrobats. It is run by clerks. And so there is another pit, and standing in it are 12 figures, the bureaucrats of the buried state, 8 of them scribes. And each scribe carries, tucked into his belt, the exact tools of the Chinese civil servant: a small knife and a whetstone for sharpening the bamboo writing slips and scraping away mistakes in the records. He needed the paperwork of empire to go on, so he buried the clerks to keep it, with their correction knives ready at their waists. And this is a strange kind of grave good. It is not treasure, not the gold and jade a king is buried with to display his wealth. It is infrastructure. A dead ruler does not need a strong man to heave a cauldron or a scribe to sharpen a pen, unless he means to go on holding court. The pits only make sense if you take the emperor at his exact word. He was not preparing to be buried. He was preparing to keep governing, and he expected the work of empire to carry on around him in the dark. Look at what is gathering here. Not a grave with some treasure in it, a garrison, then a troupe of performers, then a working civil service, each in its own pit, each a real department of a real state, copied at full size and lowered into the earth. And he was not finished. He had seen to his defense, his entertainment, and his administration. He had not yet dealt with his pleasures, his arsenal, or his capital city. So he built those too. Start with his pleasures. Every court has its gardens, its ornamental waters, where a ruler can sit and watch birds move along a river. So there is a pit, dug beside a channel shaped to imitate a flowing stream, and along that artificial bank stand 46 birds cast in bronze, cranes, geese and swans, some posed stepping through the shallows, one with its beak dipped as though it had just speared a fish. Around them are figures of musicians and attendants set to play beside the water. He had buried a riverside park, with the birds and the music laid on, so that the dead emperor could take his ease. Then his arsenal. In another pit lie suits of armour, and they are not leather and not bronze. They are stone. 87 sets of it, each one cut from hundreds of small plates of limestone, every plate shaped and drilled and laced to the next with fine bronze wire, exactly the way real armour of metal or hide would be laced. Armour of stone can stop nothing and shield no one. It could never be worn, and it was never meant to be. It existed only to fill the armory of the buried state, because a state has an armory, and so this one would have one too. By now, it is hard to keep count. The soldiers, the acrobats, the scribes, the birds, the stone arsenal. And these are only the pieces that have been found, scattered across a site so large that it took decades simply to map it. Because the whole thing, the entire necropolis, is not really a grave at all. It is a city. Here is the scale of it. The whole tomb complex is enclosed by walls, an inner wall and an outer wall, set out in a great double rectangle. The inner circuit running about 2.5 kilometers around, the outer nearer 6. Inside those walls, archaeologists have now mapped more than 600 separate pits and structures. And the layout of it, the gates, the walls, the palace at the center on its hill, is a deliberate copy of one specific, real place. Shenyang, the emperor's living capital, the city he actually ruled from. He built a second capital, a working double of the city of the living, and laid it into the ground over an area of more than 50 square kilometers. UNESCO, which lists the site, describes it in just those terms: a microcosm, a miniature of the whole empire, buried entire. There was even the engineering to keep it dry, to stop the groundwater of the plain from ever seeping in and drowning his buried world. His builders laid a thick underground barrier of impermeable clay around the tomb and cut long channels to carry the water away downhill. It is one reason that the sealed chamber at the center still reads as dry today. And a ruler of a capital travels. He inspects his lands. He shows himself to his people. He moves. So, of course, there is transport. West of the mound, buried in its own wooden chamber, archaeologists found 2 chariots cast in bronze at half life-size, each with 4 horses and a driver. They are made of thousands of separate cast pieces, fitted together with more than 14 kilograms of gold and silver in the harness and the trim, among the finest bronze work to survive from the ancient Chinese world. They are the imperial carriage, standing ready, so that the dead emperor could go on touring the empire he refused to leave. Stand back from the whole of it. A garrison, an entertainment corps, a civil service, a pleasure garden, an arsenal, a walled capital, and a carriage kept ready at the gate. Pit by pit, over an area the size of a small city, the first emperor had reproduced the entire working apparatus of a living state and buried it, so that not one function of empire would be missing when he needed it. A whole world underground, complete in every part. It was only ever waiting for one thing: its emperor. A world like that is not dug by ghosts. Someone built it by hand, tens of thousands of them, and the earth kept a record of who they were. Near the necropolis lie the burial grounds of the workers, and modern science can read their bones. The chemistry of a skeleton carries the signature of the food a person ate, and the region they grew up in, and it stays locked into the teeth and the bone for good. In one cemetery, the dead were local men, raised on the millet of the northern plains, laid out in their own individual graves. In another place, a pit, the story is uglier. 14 men, thrown in together. Some of them still had iron restraints on their bodies when they died. And the chemistry of their bones did not match the local millet eaters at all. It matched the diet of the far south, most likely the conquered lands of Chu, hundreds of miles away. These were prisoners, men hauled north out of the territories the emperor had swallowed, worked, kept in irons, and dumped in a common grave when they were used up. Underneath the tourist photograph of the silent clay ranks, there is this, the real people, in chains, who put them in the ground. How many died raising the emperor's afterlife, no one can honestly say. The histories give a vast round number for the workforce, but the graves are not a number. They are people, hauled from the far corners of a conquered land and worked until the work killed them, so that one ruler could go on being served after his own death. The clay soldiers are what the visitors come to photograph. These prisoners, in the ground beneath them, are part of what the soldiers were standing on. And every piece of it, everything we have just walked through, is the outside. The guard, the acrobats, the buried offices, the birds, the stone armory, the walls, the carriage, the graves of the men who dug them. All of it faces inward, toward the one point it was built to serve and to shield. That point is the hill. A mile west of the soldiers, under that low green mound the tourists drive past, lies the one part of the whole complex that no spade has ever touched. The tomb itself. The sealed chamber with the man still inside it. We have mapped the outside of it in enormous detail. About the inside we have almost nothing. We have one paragraph. What the instruments can make out from the surface is this. Under the mound is a large underground structure, a palace of rammed earth and stone, and at its heart a central chamber, roughly 80 meters long and 50 wide, standing perhaps 15 meters tall, buried around 30 meters down. The surveys show no sign that it has collapsed, no sign that water has flooded it. As far as the instruments can tell, the chamber is intact, sealed, and waiting, just as it was closed. That is the shape of the box. It tells us almost nothing about what is inside it. For that, there is one source. One. Almost everything the world believes about the inside of that chamber comes from a single passage, only a few sentences long, written by a historian named C. Chen. And two things about him matter here. He was writing around the year 94 before Christ, which is more than a century after the tomb was sealed. And he never went inside. No one of his generation had. He was setting down what was remembered, or what was claimed, about a room that had already been shut and buried for 100 years before he ever lifted his brush. Everything that follows rests on those few sentences, and on the honesty of a witness reporting something he could not see. There is a fair question buried in that. Why trust him at all? The answer is that where we have been able to check Sim Chen against the ground, he has tended to hold up. He set down, for one, a list of the kings of the Shang, a dynasty 1,000 years older than his own, which scholars long suspected he had largely invented. Then, in the 20th century, inscribed bones were dug out of the earth at the old Shang capital, carrying the king's own records, and his list very nearly matched. He was not a teller of tales, he was a careful setter down of what he had been told. Which is why his one paragraph about this tomb is worth taking seriously. And it is also why the paragraph is not enough. Here is what he wrote. He records that the workers dug down through 3 underground streams and sealed the base with poured bronze. That above the coffin they set the heavens, the sun and the moon and the stars, and below it the features of the earth. And then comes the line that has haunted the site ever since. Mercury, he writes, was used to fashion the 100 rivers of the empire, the Yangtze and the Yellow River and the Great Sea itself, and it was made by some mechanism to flow. A map of the emperor's whole watery world, rendered in liquid metal, moving under a ceiling of painted stars around the body of the man at the center. He adds that crossbows were rigged to fire on anyone who broke in, and that the lamps were filled with a fuel calculated to burn for a very long time. It is one of the most extraordinary descriptions in all of ancient literature, and it has to be handled with care. Some of it may be exactly true. Some of it may be legend that grew in the 100 years between the sealing and the writing. From the outside, we have no way to tell the two apart. Except for one line. There is one claim in that passage, the wildest sounding one of all, the rivers of flowing mercury, that we can actually test. Because you do not have to open the chamber to look for mercury. Mercury gives itself away. It rises as invisible vapor up through 30 meters of earth and reaches the surface on the top of a quiet green hill where an instrument can catch it. So a team of scientists went up onto the mound and they measured. And the mercury was there. Across the top of the mound, the soil holds several times as much mercury as the ordinary ground around it. And it is not spread evenly. It concentrates toward the center, and at the single hottest point the surveys have found, the reading runs to nearly 50 times the natural background. Decades later, in 2020, a different team came back with a laser instrument that reads mercury vapor in the open air and found the air directly over the mound carrying several times the normal background as well. A faint plume of the metal breathing up out of the ground. The anomaly is real. It has been measured and remeasured and confirmed over 40 years by different methods. There is a great deal of mercury under that hill, and it is concentrated precisely over the buried chamber. That last detail matters more than the raw amount. Mercury does not gather itself into a neat patch in the middle of a plain for no reason. Something put it there, directly beneath the mound, in quantity, a very long time ago, and it has been seeping quietly upward ever since. What the science actually found is smaller than the legend and harder to explain away. No one has seen a river. No instrument has imaged anything flowing. Under the mound sits a real, measured concentration of mercury in the soil and in the air, unusually high and unusually localized. And some researchers note that the way it is spread across the mound loosely echoes the geography of the empire's real rivers, with more of it where the sea and the great rivers would lie on a map of the country. The team behind the 2020 study was careful about what they claimed. They did not say they had found the rivers. Their own conclusion was only that the readings, in their words, add to the credibility of the ancient record. Corroboration, not proof. The histories said mercury. The ground says mercury. That is as far as the evidence reaches, and they refuse to push it any further. There is even now a good idea of where the mercury came from. A survey in 2025 traced a likely source to ancient cinnabar mines about 100 kilometers from the tomb, in a district that still holds a large share of China's mercury reserves. The poison had a supply chain. Someone mined that red ore by the ton and carried it across 100 kilometers of country to the tomb. So what is actually down there? From the surface, we can only reason about it. Suppose the old account is close to right, and the distribution really does trace the empire's waterways. Then a man built a working relief model of his conquered world in a metal that moves and lay down to rest in the middle of it. Or suppose the chamber has partly given way over the centuries, and what reaches the surface is simply a great mass of mercury slowly evaporating and leaking upward, with no rivers and no design left intact. Or suppose some part of the surface reading is more recent, industrial, unrelated, though the tight way it clusters over the mound and nowhere else nearby argues against that being the whole story. We cannot open the box to settle it, but we can say this. The strangest thing the histories claim about this tomb is also the one part of it the modern world has been able to reach out and touch.
Most versions of this story, right about here, reach for the supernatural. The true account is stranger, and it has the advantage of being true. There is a whole genre of the tomb of the first emperor online, and it tends to sell three things in particular. Each one is worth taking down. The first is the super weapons. The story goes that the bronze swords and arrowheads of the buried army were coated, by some lost technology, in a thin film of chromium, the same anti-rust plating we put on tools today, 2,000 years before anyone else is supposed to have discovered it, and that this is why they came out of the earth bright and sharp. It is a wonderful story. In 2019, it was tested properly. Researchers examined hundreds of the weapons and found the chromium on only a few dozen of them, and where it did appear, it had no relationship at all to how well the weapon had survived. The chromium was not a coating. It had leached onto the bronze after burial from the lacquer on nearby wooden fittings. What had really kept the weapons sharp was the chemistry of the very fine, dry, alkaline soil they had been lying in. The wonder was real, the explanation was ordinary and true. The second thing the story sells is the number. 700,000 men, it says, laboured on this tomb. That figure is real, in the sense that it sits in the histories, in the same source, from the same hand, reporting the same events, but it is a single ancient number, round and grand, of the kind ancient writers reached for when they simply meant a very great many. The archaeologist who led the site for years came to believe the account was written more to impress than to count, and that the truly intensive building took something closer to 7 years than to a lifetime. Other scholars, working from what that region could actually feed and house, put the real workforce in the tens of thousands at a time, not the hundreds of thousands. An enormous undertaking still, just not a mythic one. And the third thing the story sells is fear. The tomb is sealed, it says, because the authorities are terrified of what is inside, the poison, the traps, the curse. The real reason is much quieter, and it is one the excavated army itself taught us. When those clay soldiers first came out of the ground, they were not the bare grey we see in the museum today. They were painted. Brilliantly, every one of them. Pink flesh, dark hair, armour in reds and greens, and a vivid purple that the Qin manufactured and almost no other ancient people had. The colour was laid over a base coat of lacquer, and that lacquer had been sitting in wet earth for 2,000 years. Lifted into our dry, modern air, it does something terrible. It curls and lifts away from the clay and carries the paint off with it within minutes of exposure. The painted first emperor came up in full color and turned grey while the archaeologists watched, faster than they could save it. That is the real reason the great chamber stays shut. Not fear, restraint. To open that tomb today, with the tools we have today, would be to destroy the very thing you had opened it to see, what the color died on the soldiers. The people who guard it are not hiding from a curse. They are waiting, perhaps a century, for a way to go in that does not annihilate what is inside. Everything the honest instruments tell us about this place turns out to be more remarkable than the story sold on top of it. The instruments read the ground he lies under. But to understand why that ground is poisoned, we have to leave the surveys and the surface behind and go back to the man himself, more than 2,000 years ago, while he was still alive, still ruling. And, though he did not know it yet, already dying. In the year 210 before Christ, the first emperor was on the road. He was on the last of his great inspection tours, carried across his empire in the imperial procession, doing the thing he had always done, showing himself to his realm, and hunting still for the immortality that had never come. He was about 49 years old. Somewhere in the east of his empire, at a place called Shaqiu, a long way from his capital, he fell ill. And he died. The histories name no cause. He simply sickened on the road and was gone. But there is an irony here that historians have never been able to leave alone. For years, this man had been swallowing the elixir of life, mercury. In the doses a court physician might prescribe to a determined emperor, taken over years, mercury is a slow poison. And its effects, a creeping tremor, deepening paranoia, a mind turning fearful and confused, are a fair match for the little we are told of his final years. The leading suspicion is that the cure was what killed him. It can only ever be a suspicion. There is no body to test, and the record names no cause. The elixir he drank to escape death may have been the very thing that carried death into him, cup by cup. He went to war against death with mercury, and mercury may have been the door death came in by. What happened next is one of the strangest scenes in the histories, and it is a grimly fitting one. The emperor had died far from home, on tour, and the men travelling with him grasped at once how dangerous that was. He had never settled the succession cleanly. If word got out on the road that the first emperor was dead, the empire he had welded together by force might fly apart before the procession ever reached the capital. So his chancellor and a trusted eunuch, a man named Shaqiu, made a decision. They did not announce the death. They kept the covered carriage rolling, as if the emperor were only resting inside it, out of view. Meals were carried in to the dead man behind the curtains. Officials made their daily reports to a corpse, and because it was high summer and the body had begun to turn and the smell threatened to give the whole thing away, they loaded a cart with salted fish and drove it alongside the imperial carriage so that no one on the road would wonder why the emperor's procession had started to stink. The man who had conquered an entire world and then spent a fortune and a lifetime trying never to die was being carried home in secret, rotting, hidden behind a screen of stinking fish, while a eunuch at his side forged documents in his name.
On the road, they used that forged authority to send an order to his eldest son and rightful heir, commanding him to take his own life. He obeyed. And in his place, they set a younger, weaker son who would be easy to control. He had wanted to rule forever. He could not hold his own throne for the length of a journey home.
They got him home, and they buried him. The histories say that when the funeral was done, the great tomb was closed for good, that the inner passage was blocked, the outer gate lowered, and the workers and craftsmen who had built the tomb and knew the way to its treasures were sealed inside it, so that its secrets would die along with them. We cannot verify that for the central chamber. No one has been in to look, and it comes to us, like the rivers of mercury, from that same single source. But that is what the record says was done. The door was shut. And then, the very thing he had built all of this to outlast came apart with astonishing speed. The first emperor had meant his dynasty to rule for 10,000 generations. It managed 2. His weak younger son was manipulated and then discarded by the same eunuch who had put him on the throne. Rebellion broke out across the overtaxed, overworked empire, and within 4 years of the emperor's death, the Qin dynasty was simply gone. The very things that had raised the tomb helped pull the dynasty down. The taxes that paid for it, the forced labor that dug it, the harshness that had held the young empire together by fear, all of it had made the Qin hated, and once the strong hand at the center was gone, the hatred came out. The most formidable state the ancient Chinese world had yet produced destroyed itself in less time than it had taken to build one emperor's grave. The rebels reached the necropolis. The pits of the buried army show it plainly. They were broken into, the real bronze weapons carried off, and the great wooden chambers set on fire, so that the burning roofs collapsed down onto the ranks of soldiers and smashed them where they stood. The histories give the name of the warlord thought to have done it, though the pits themselves can only tell us that someone did. The magnificent painted army was wrecked within a few years of being finished. But they never reached the man. For all the burning above ground, there is no sign that the sealed chamber under the mound was ever broken into. The tomb held. And so we are left with this. The empire that was built to last 10,000 generations lasted 15 years. The tomb that was built to hold one dead man has lasted 22 centuries, and it is holding still. Come back up, out of the earth, to the hill. It is still there, in Shaanxi, under the same wide sky. A low green mound with grass on it and a few trees, and the light going long and cold as the day ends. A mile to the east, the clay soldiers stand in their ranks in the dark of the pits, facing outward, away from the hill, guarding the back of a man they will never see. And in the soil of the mound, an instrument would still find it, the faint, cold trace of mercury, still rising up through 30 meters of earth and loess, the same metal he swallowed to live forever, 22 centuries after they closed the door. He is still down there. That is the plain fact the hill comes down to. The most powerful man of the ancient world could beat every human enemy that stood against him, and could not beat the last one. And everything under that mound, the army, the buried government, the poisoned ground, the sealed chamber, is what one man's fear of dying built, with the wealth of an empire, when he could not accept that it would end. We could open it.
One day, when the tools are gentle enough, someone probably will, and we will finally see what the histories have only ever promised. But not yet. For now, the door stays shut, and there is something fitting in that. Because in the only sense that was ever left to him, the Emperor is still winning. The war he could not win against death, he has also never quite lost. He lies at the center of the world he built, untouched, unseen, unfinished, refusing to end. And the poison he drank to live forever is still quietly keeping everyone out.